Have you ever wondered how the ancient Greeks viewed sexuality? Their perspective was far from black and white. The ancient Greeks, a civilization that flourished thousands of years ago, held a distinctive view on sexuality. This view was not confined to the binary definitions we are familiar with in the modern Western world. It was a realm of fluidity, a realm that embraced the spectrum of human desire, unbounded by the rigid labels and categories we so often use today. In ancient Greece, it was not about whom you loved, but how you loved. Their society was not concerned with the gender of one's partner, but rather the nature of the relationship and the roles each individual played within it. This perspective is a stark contrast to how we often perceive sexual orientation in the present day. There were no neatly defined labels like heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. The Greeks did not categorize their desires in such a way. Instead, they recognized that human sexuality was a complex and multifaceted aspect of their existence, one that could not be easily boxed into a single category. This open-minded approach allowed for a spectrum of sexual preferences to exist. It acknowledged the fluidity of attraction and desire, understanding that these feelings could shift and evolve over a person's lifetime. This acceptance of fluidity was, in many ways, far ahead of its time, and it is a perspective we are only just beginning to understand and embrace in our modern society. The Greeks' understanding of sexuality was deeply intertwined with their culture, their philosophy, and their social norms. It was a reflection of their broader worldview, one that saw beauty and love in all forms, regardless of gender or physical form. So, what exactly were these perspectives? Let's delve into the historical records. One of the most recognized practices in ancient Greece was pederasty. This practice, steeped in societal acceptance, was an institutionalized form of mentorship and bonding between an older man, known as the erastes, and a younger boy, referred to as the eromenos. Pederasty was not merely a sexual relationship. It was an essential aspect of the Greek social fabric, playing a vital role in the transmission of culture, knowledge, and societal norms from one generation to the next. The erastes, typically a mature man of social standing, would choose an eromenos, usually in his teens, and take on the responsibility of educating and guiding him. This relationship was a blend of intellectual, spiritual, and physical bonding. The erastes provided the eromenos with education, protection, and even helped him establish his social and political connections. In return, the eromenos offered companionship and accepted the erastes as his mentor. It was a bond of mutual consent and respect, anchored in the societal expectations of the time. This practice was so deeply rooted in ancient Greek culture that it was reflected in their art, literature, and mythology. From the beautiful pottery depicting scenes of pederasty to the tales of Zeus and Ganymede, pederasty was an integral part of the Greek narrative. However, it's important to note that the concept of pederasty in ancient Greece was far removed from the modern understanding of pedophilia. The Greeks saw this practice as a rite of passage, a form of education, and a way of forming lasting bonds. It was a relationship centered around love, respect, and mutual growth, not exploitation or abuse. Intriguing, isn't it? But this was just one aspect of ancient Greek sexuality. As we delve deeper into this fascinating topic, we'll uncover even more layers of complexity, challenging our modern perspectives and shedding light on the fluidity of sexuality in ancient Greece. When discussing ancient Greek sexuality, one cannot ignore the role of women. In a society that was undoubtedly male-dominated, women were expected to fulfill certain roles that extended into their sexual lives. Women in ancient Greece were often seen as the custodians of morality and virtue, a perception that significantly influenced their sexual freedom. They were expected to maintain their chastity until marriage and then devote themselves to their husbands. This concept was deeply ingrained in Greek society, and women who deviated from this expectation often faced severe societal repercussions. Marriage, for women in ancient Greece, was not about romantic love or sexual desire. Instead, it was a societal obligation, a duty they had to fulfill to ensure the continuation of their husband's family line. Often marriages were arranged with the bride's family providing a dowry in exchange for the groom's promise of protection and provision. It's important to note, however, that this was not a universal practice and variations existed depending on the region and the time period. This societal expectation stands in stark contrast to the sexual freedom enjoyed by men in ancient Greece. Men were not bound by the same societal norms and were free to engage in relationships outside of their marriages. This freedom extended to relationships with other men. a practice that was not only accepted but also celebrated in certain circles. However, this contrast shouldn't lead us to believe that women were completely powerless or lacked agency. There were exceptions to these rules, and some women wielded considerable influence within their households and communities. While their roles may have been defined by societal norms, women found ways to navigate these expectations and assert their individuality. Despite this contrast, there was another sexual orientation that included women. As we delve deeper into ancient Greek sexuality, we'll explore this orientation and the unique ways in which it was expressed. So, stay tuned as we continue our journey into the fascinating world of ancient Greek sexual orientations. Bisexuality was not uncommon in the ancient Greek world. In fact, it was a rather prevalent aspect of their society, interwoven into both their daily lives and their mythologies. To understand this, we must first delve into the societal norms of the period. In the ancient Greek world, bisexuality was not viewed as a contradiction to the institution of marriage. Instead, it was seen as a natural part of human sexuality, and a man's love for both men and women was often celebrated. It was common for men to have wives for the purpose of procreation, and also maintain relationships with other men for companionship and intellectual stimulation. This acceptance and prevalence of bisexuality can be seen reflected in their mythology and literature. Let's take the god Apollo, for instance. He was known to have had both male and female lovers. His love for the nymph Daphne and the youth Hyacinth are well-known stories that depict his bisexuality. Similarly, the goddess Aphrodite, the embodiment of love and beauty, was depicted in relationships with both gods and goddesses. In literature, we see bisexuality depicted in the works of Plato, one of the most influential philosophers of ancient Greece. In his Symposium, he presents the idea of love being divided into two types: heavenly love, which is non-sexual and intellectual, often occurring between males, and common love, which is sexual and occurs between men and women. This highlights the acceptance of bisexuality and its integration into philosophical thought. However, it is important to note that this acceptance did not extend to all forms of same-sex relationships. The Greeks held a different view on sexuality than we do today, and their norms and expectations varied greatly from ours. The relationships between men were often expected to include an element of mentorship, with one partner being older and more experienced. Understanding the context of bisexuality in ancient Greece allows us to see that their views on sexuality were complex and nuanced, much like our own. It also helps us to understand the fluidity of human sexuality throughout history. Now, what about homosexuality as we understand it today? The concept of homosexuality as a distinct sexual orientation did not exist in ancient Greece as it does today. This is a statement that might be surprising to many. However, it's crucial to understand that the way we perceive and categorize sexual orientations today is vastly different from how the ancient Greeks did. In ancient Greece, there was no word or concept equivalent to our modern understanding of homosexuality. There were no labels, no categories, and certainly no stigma tied to same-sex relationships as we see in various societies today. Instead, the ancient Greeks viewed sexual relationships through the lens of roles and status. In these relationships, the Erastes, usually an older man, would take on an active dominant role, while the Eromenos, typically a younger male, assumed a passive submissive role. These roles were not just about sexual dynamics, but were also tied to social status, age, and authority. Interestingly, these relationships were also rarely seen as lifelong commitments. Instead, they were often considered a part of the Eromenos' education, a way for the younger man to learn about politics, warfare, and philosophy. Once the Eromenos came of age, it was expected he would become an Erastes to another young man, continuing the cycle. It's essential to note that these relationships were not hidden or considered shameful. They were openly discussed, celebrated in poetry and art, and even had a place in religious rituals. However, these relationships were strictly regulated, with societal norms dictating the conduct within them to prevent any abuse of power or status. So, when we look back at ancient Greece, we see a society that didn't classify individuals based on who they were attracted to, but rather on the roles they played within their relationships. It was a society that embraced a spectrum of sexual experiences without the need for rigid categorization. In this light, the way we understand and define homosexuality today seems to be a construct of modern times, shaped by social, cultural, and even political influences. The ancient Greeks had a nuanced understanding of sexuality, didn't they? The ancient Greeks did not categorize their sexuality in the way we do today. This statement might seem surprising, but it's essential to understanding their perspective on this complex issue. In the Greek world, sexuality was seen through a different lens, one not defined by rigid categories or labels but rather by personal preference and societal roles. In the realm of ancient Greece, love and attraction were seen as fluid, not confined to the binary of heterosexuality and homosexuality as we understand them today. Instead, it was about the dynamics of power, age, status, and beauty. It was not whom you loved, but how you loved that mattered. The Greeks did not have words for gay or straight. They didn't define themselves by the gender of their partners. Instead, they focused on the act, the role one played in the relationship. The Erastes, usually an older, educated man, would pursue the Eromenos, a younger, uneducated boy. This was seen as a formative relationship, a rite of passage even, rather than a sexual preference. This fluid approach to sexuality is starkly different from our modern understanding. Today we often use labels to define our sexual orientation, creating rigid categories that might not fully encompass the complexities of human desire and attraction. In contrast, the ancient Greeks acknowledged the fluidity of these feelings and embraced a broader spectrum of sexual experiences. Moreover, societal roles played a significant part in these relationships. The balance of power and the exchange of knowledge were integral components, often more important than physical attraction. This is not to say that the Greeks did not value physical beauty, they certainly did, but there was a deeper understanding that relationships were multifaceted, encompassing more than just physical desire. So, as we've seen, the ancient Greeks had a unique perspective on sexuality. They saw it as a fluid, nuanced experience, shaped by personal preferences and societal dynamics. Their approach challenges our modern notions of sexuality, suggesting that our understanding of this complex issue is constantly evolving. Today, we've explored the intricate world of sexual orientation in ancient Greece. We've journeyed through the complex labyrinth of their societal norms and perceptions, and it's been quite the odyssey. We began our exploration by shedding light on the practice of pederasty, a societal norm in ancient Greece that involved a relationship between an adult male and a younger male. This practice was not just about physical attraction, but rather a form of mentorship, where the elder imparted wisdom, education, and societal values to the younger. Next, we ventured into the world of women in ancient Greece. Although their role was often confined to the domestic sphere, their influence was not to be underestimated. The Greeks believed in a balance of masculine and feminine, and women played a significant part in maintaining this equilibrium. We also discussed the prevalence of bisexuality, a common practice in ancient Greece. The Greeks didn't categorize sexuality as we do today. Instead, they focused on the beauty of the human form, regardless of gender, making bisexuality a common practice. We also delved into the absence of a concept of homosexuality. For the ancient Greeks, the act of loving someone of the same sex wasn't labeled or stigmatized. It was just another form of love, devoid of the labels and categories we use today. Finally, we explored the fluidity of sexuality in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks didn't see sexual orientation as a fixed trait, but as a spectrum of desires that could change over time. This fluidity was accepted and even celebrated, reflecting a level of openness and acceptance that is still sought after today. As we conclude, let's remember that the Greeks' understanding of sexuality was vastly different from ours. Their society was a testament to the diverse expressions of human love and desire, challenging our modern-day notions about sexuality. Remember, understanding the past can help us better understand and appreciate the diversity of human experience today. Until next time, keep exploring history.